Right now, your brain is burning roughly a quarter of your body's total energy supply just to pay attention to this sentence.
Which is a huge amount of energy, if you really think about it.
It is. I mean, think about that for a second. This simple act of focusing isn't just some, abstract mental state. It is a highly demanding, calorie-burning biological process.
Right.
But what happens when that energy grid starts kind of browning out?
Mm-hmm.
You sit down at your desk, you stare at the screen,
Yep.
you know exactly what you need to do, but the mental engine simply refuses to engage.
And it's a terrifying feeling, that sudden powerlessness. And unfortunately, because we live in a society that constantly demands, peak productivity, when that focus drops, the immediate assumption is that something within you is fundamentally broken.
Yeah, exactly.
We treat a lack of concentration as a personal failing or a permanent glitch in the hardware.
Well, welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. Today, we are looking at the real reasons why your concentration might be falling apart in a deep dive we're calling the architecture of focus.
It's such a critical topic.
It really is, and we have a fascinating stack of sources to guide us today. First, we have an excerpt that breaks down the deeply psychological and neurological roots of focus issues. It specifically pulls apart the tangled threads of ADHD, anxiety, and severe burnout.
Right. And we are pairing that clinical understanding with a very tangible resource guide from Coping and Healing Counseling, or CHC. They're a telehealth practice based out in Georgia.
Which is a great pairing, honestly.
Having both is essential because, understanding the neuroscience of why you cannot focus is intellectually satisfying, sure. But without a practical blueprint for how to actually get help, it just becomes another piece of trivia.
Exactly. The mission of this deep dive is to help you untangle the why behind your lost focus.
Yeah.
We want to empower you to understand the actual mechanics of your own brain.
And give you the context to seek a real professional evaluation.
Right, rather than relying on, a social media algorithm to diagnose you. Okay, let's unpack this. If we want to fix a broken attention span, we first have to accurately identify the blueprint of the problem.
Because a loss of focus isn't a single disease.
No, it's a symptom. And it has very distinct roots.
Yeah, when we talk about a chronic inability to concentrate, we are often looking at two very distinct clinical pillars that clash and get constantly confused with one another. And those are ADHD and anxiety.
Because from the outside, they look pretty much identical, right?
They do. It's a person staring blankly at a spreadsheet, just completely unable to initiate a task. But internally, the neurological mechanisms are worlds apart.
Let's start with ADHD, because the source material really emphasizes the timeline here. This isn't something that just, suddenly pops up in your 30s because you had a bad quarter at work.
No, the pattern goes all the way back.
Right. It involves a lifelong struggle with focus, with organization, managing time, and follow-through. It is pervasive across everything, like work, school, chores, hobbies.
Because it is a neurodevelopmental reality. ADHD is fundamentally a condition of dopamine regulation in the prefrontal cortex.
And dopamine is the reward chemical, right?
It's essentially the brain's reward currency, yes, but it also acts as the signal-to-noise ratio modulator.
Oh, that's interesting. What does that mean exactly?
Well, when your prefrontal cortex has enough dopamine, it can easily distinguish between the signal, which is the important task you need to do, and the noise. The noise being the sound of traffic outside or a random thought about your grocery list.
Okay, I see.
In an ADHD brain, that dopamine baseline is chronically low. The brain is basically starving for stimulation just to reach a functional baseline, so it bounces around desperately seeking anything that will provide that neurochemical hit.
And that leads perfectly into the concept of hyperfocus, which our source mentions. Because I think people assume ADHD means you can literally never focus.
Right, which is a huge misconception.
Yeah. Actually, when the ADHD brain finds something highly stimulating, it completely locks on. Kind of made me think of television. Having ADHD is basically like having a TV remote that is permanently stuck clicking only to channels that feature massive explosions, high-speed car chases, and absolute high drama.
That's a fun way to look at it.
The remote literally will not let you stop and watch a quiet documentary about gardening. It just keeps clicking until it finds the fireworks.
I mean, the TV remote analogy is helpful for visualization, but I'd argue it's a bit too passive. It's more like a highly magnetized compass.
A magnetized compass.
Yeah. The ADHD brain is literally being pulled toward high dopamine activities by magnetic force against its own conscious will. That's why willpower alone cannot fix it. You can't just try harder to ignore a magnet.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
What's fascinating here is the permanence of that state. That baseline dopamine deficit is the fundamental operating system of the ADHD brain. It is a persistent structural reality.
Okay, so contrast that with our second pillar, anxiety.
Hmm.
Because anxiety also shatters focus, but the mechanism is an entirely different biological pathway. How so? Because, again, to a manager or a teacher, it looks exactly the same. The work isn't getting done.
It looks the same, but the internal architecture is driven by the amygdala, not a baseline dopamine deficit. With anxiety, the source explains that worry is the active interrupter.
You just can't concentrate because your brain is constantly running scenarios.
Right. You are anticipating threats, rehearsing difficult conversations, preparing for a worst-case outcome. Evolutionarily, your amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, has decided there is a tiger in the room.
And if there's a tiger, you shouldn't be looking at a spreadsheet.
Exactly. When there's a tiger in the room, the brain literally reroutes blood flow and metabolic energy away from the prefrontal cortex, which handles deep focus and long-term planning. It sends it all to the limbic system to prepare for fight or flight.
You literally can't focus on the spreadsheet because your brain thinks you are about to be eaten.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So if ADHD is the magnet pulling you toward fireworks, anxiety is the emergency broadcast system.
I like that.
You are trying to watch a perfectly good, normal TV show. Like you're trying to read a report, and suddenly, beep, the screen goes red. A massive warning scrolls across the bottom.
Right, the alarm takes over the entire broadcast.
Yeah, you can't watch your show because the emergency system is demanding your immediate attention to a perceived threat.
That is exactly the mechanism. And here is the defining feature that separates the two, according to our source. State dependence.
Meaning it changes based on your state of mind.
Yes. With anxiety, the minute that worry loop closes, the minute the brain realizes there is no tiger, the emergency broadcast system turns off and the focus comes back.
Oh, wow.
The underlying machinery to concentrate is fully intact and functional. It was simply being hijacked. ADHD doesn't go away when you go on vacation and relax. Anxiety-driven focus loss does.
That is such a massive distinction. But we have to look at the third factor introduced in the source material, and this is the one that I think is going to hit home for almost everyone listening.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got the lifelong wiring of ADHD. We've got the loud alarms of anxiety. But then we have the life factor, because the sheer weight of existing in the modern world can completely mimic both of these clinical conditions.
It creates a giant diagnostic trap. We are talking about severe physiological exhaustion disguised as psychological dysfunction.
The source lists these incredibly specific stressors, like you are not sleeping, you are under-eating, or you are over-caffeinating, just to keep your eyes open at 2 in the afternoon.
And the life events, too.
Right. Maybe you've had 3 major life stressors in the last 6 months. A move, a job change, a loss. You are parenting a toddler. You are caregiving for an aging relative.
Or you literally have not had a real, actual day off where nothing was required of you in months.
Exactly. And it is vital to explicitly state that these are not psychological disorders. Those are the brutal physiological realities of modern existence.
So true.
So what does this all mean? The source has this brilliant quote. It says, your focus isn't broken. Your brain is doing what an exhausted brain does.
I love that quote.
Honestly, it makes me wonder if society is just constantly pathologizing the crime of being exhausted. We're so quick to slap a medical label on someone who is just fundamentally depleted. It's like trying to run a smartphone on 1% battery while opening 20 heavy apps.
The phone isn't broken, it just needs to be plugged in.
Exactly.
I see what you're saying, and it is a vital point, though we have to be careful not to dismiss the very real need for clinical support. But you are right, we cannot pathologize survival mode.
Right.
Think of burnout like an economy going into a severe recession. Your brain is practicing cognitive austerity.
Cognitive austerity, that's a great term.
When biological resources like sleep, calories, and peace are dangerously low, the brain starts shutting down what it considers frivolous departments. Deep concentration, emotional regulation, and long-term planning. Those are expensive departments to run.
So it just defunds them.
It defunds them and reallocates all available energy to the staying awake and surviving the day department. Your focus isn't broken. It was intentionally shut down to conserve energy.
That makes so much sense. But the truly terrifying part of the source material is when it points out that these things rarely happen in isolation. A lot of people have two of these going on at once.
Oh, easily. And plenty of people have all three simultaneously.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, imagine the internal chaos of that overlapping environment. You have the baseline dopamine-seeking wiring of ADHD.
Compound that with the constant high alert scenario running of an anxiety disorder.
Now layer both of those underneath the crushing physical exhaustion and cognitive austerity of parenting a toddler while working full-time.
Right. It creates an internal environment that is virtually impossible for any individual to untangle objectively from the inside.
Which brings us to the danger of the self-diagnosis era. Because these three drivers overlap heavily, trying to figure it out yourself is a losing game.
It really is.
The source material has a very explicit warning against the whole TikTok quiz phenomenon.
The psychological allure of self-diagnosis on social media is incredibly strong. You are suffering, you are confused, and a 60-second video offers you a neat package label that explains all your pain.
Finding a label feels like finding a cure, even when it isn't.
Precisely.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Isn't there an argument that TikTok and social media are actually democratizing mental health information?
How do you mean?
Well, for decades, people didn't even have the vocabulary to describe their anxiety or their neurodivergence.
Well,
now they finally have the words.
democratization of vocabulary is a wonderful thing, yes. But democratization of vocabulary is not the same thing as democratization of clinical expertise.
That's a really good point.
A social media quiz cannot differentiate between a structural brain difference, a state-dependent worry loop, and severe sleep deprivation. Only a trained clinician can look at the holistic context of your life, take a full history, and untangle those deeply knotted threads.
Right. The source explicitly says, the point of understanding these different architectures of focus is not to diagnose yourself. The point is to hear yourself in these descriptions so that you feel empowered to seek an actual professional evaluation.
Exactly.
But knowing the root of your focus issue doesn't help if your life burnout includes financial anxiety. The stress of trying to find and pay for therapy can actually trigger the exact anxiety loop and cognitive austerity we just talked about.
It's a vicious cycle.
Think about the executive function paradox. You need high executive function to navigate the healthcare system. Find an in-network provider, call them, leave a voicemail, schedule an appointment, and drive across town.
But a lack of executive function is the exact reason you need the doctor in the first place.
Exactly. It is a systemic barrier that keeps millions of people trapped in that state of burnout.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This is exactly why the second half of our source material, the Practical Guide from Coping and Healing Counseling, or CHC, is so crucial.
It provides a literal blueprint for removing those barriers.
Yes. They are a telehealth therapy practice serving all 159 counties in Georgia with a 100% HIPAA-compliant telehealth model.
Which entirely eliminates the executive function paradox. You don't navigate traffic, you don't find a babysitter, you literally just open your laptop.
Telehealth turns an insurmountable wall into a very manageable step. But equally important is the clinical depth the source highlights. CHC has a diverse, culturally competent team of over 15 licensed therapists.
It is worth unpacking what those licenses actually mean, because it directly relates to the complex overlap of ADHD, anxiety, and life burnout.
Right. The source lists LCSWs, LPCs, and LMFTs. To the average person, that's just alphabet soup.
Honestly, yeah. So what do they mean?
Well, clinically, it means you have access to different tools for different roots of the problem. An LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, is heavily trained to look at the systems around you.
Like the environmental stress and the life factors causing that cognitive austerity.
Exactly. Then an LPC, a licensed professional counselor, might use cognitive behavioral therapy to directly address the amygdala hijack and worry loops of anxiety.
And the third one?
An LMFT, a licensed marriage and family therapist, specializes in untangling how your focus issues are impacting your relationships, or how a relationship crisis is actively destroying your focus.
Having a diverse mix of these licenses means that care can actually match the complexity of the patient.
Yes, and they offer individual, couples, family, and teen therapy for ages 13 and up, plus life coaching.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
Because if the root of your lost focus is a career crisis or profound stress, Having access to a life coach or couples counselor is exactly the intervention required.
Rather than jumping straight to an ADHD medication, yes.
Their specialties, like anxiety, depression, trauma, grief, stress, map flawlessly onto the drivers of focus loss we've been analyzing. But we really have to address the financial anxiety. The CHC guide lays out the costs, and it completely shifts the paradigm of accessibility.
Financial transparency in mental health care is unfortunately pretty rare, which makes this highly notable.
Get this. If you have Medicaid, the copay is $0.
$0. Wow.
Let that sink in. For someone operating under crushing cognitive austerity, removing the financial burden entirely is profound. And for other major insurances, they list Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, and Humana. The cost is generally $30 to $40 per session.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. How does knowing that professional, culturally competent help is actually accessible shift your perspective?
It changes everything.
It really does. When you move from the helpless, isolating space of a social media algorithm diagnosing you in a vacuum into a space of professional empowerment and tangible access, the entire dynamic changes.
You go from a passive victim of your brain's exhaustion to an active participant in your own care.
You are bringing in a master mechanic to look at the engine instead of just kicking the tires and hoping it starts working again.
For anyone in Georgia who hears themselves in this deep dive and needs to make that call, we'll link CHC's contact info and their website in the show notes. You can reach them at 404-832-0102 or check out chctherapy.com when you are ready to take that step.
It is real, tangible help that bridges the gap between understanding the neuroscience and actually healing from it.
It allows you to finally stop guessing in the dark.
So true.
So let's bring the pieces of the architecture back together. We started by looking at a broken attention span, not as a character flaw and not as a failure of willpower, but as a symptom with deeply biological and environmental roots.
Focus isn't one size fits all, and it doesn't shatter for just one reason.
We examined the permanent dopamine-seeking magnetism of ADHD.
We looked at the sudden, state-dependent alarms of anxiety and the amygdala hijack.
And we unpacked the sheer systemic cognitive austerity of the life factor, the burnout that shuts down our executive function just to keep us surviving.
And we saw how trying to untangle those overlapping wires by yourself, especially when you are already exhausted, is basically impossible.
Which is why culturally competent, accessible resources like CHC are so critical to the equation. So, we want to ask you directly, which of these three descriptions did you hear yourself in today?
Were you nodding along to the magnetic pull of ADHD?
The emergency broadcast of anxiety?
Or the cognitive recession of pure life burnout? Recognizing the true nature of your own symptom is the first real step toward reclaiming your focus.
But before we leave you, I want you to consider one final thought that builds on everything we've discussed today.
We spend so much time talking about a lack of concentration as something being broken. But if your focus isn't broken and your brain is simply doing what an exhausted brain does, perhaps a lack of concentration isn't a failure at all.
What if it's something else entirely?
Exactly. What if your brain dropping its focus is actually a highly evolved survival mechanism? Think about it. What if your inability to stare at that spreadsheet for one more hour is an emergency brake that your nervous system is pulling, desperately trying to force you to finally stop, step back, and rest before the entire engine catches fire?
Because if the engine cuts out, maybe the machinery isn't trying to punish you. Maybe, in its own brilliantly frustrating way, it's just trying to save your life. Until next time.